In this video, I'm going to be discussing Kant's Refutation of Idealism, which in his second edition is found at this point in the Critique of Pure Reason, right after he's been talking about the system of principles. In the first edition, it was actually later in the book, but I'm kind of going by his second edition here. And so the first question is, what is idealism? And so idealism is sort of the idea that, no pun intended, that we, in our mind, so if we say that this is in our mind, and then this over here is some object outside of our mind, so the object sort of causes some sensation or some representation of the object inside our minds. And so idealism says, well, all we can know is this object right here. We don't know that this object here actually exists. And so all we can say for sure is that this inner object exists. And so there are essentially, well, Kant kind of divides it into two different kinds of idealism. So there's dogmatic idealism, which is sort of the Berkeleyan style of idealism. And this is sort of more of a metaphysical claim, and it's the idea that objects outside us are false and impossible. And so that would be saying that this object here, it doesn't exist. So that's making a metaphysical claim that outer objects don't actually exist. Whereas the problematic idealist, which is what Kant is going to be focusing on, I think Kant sees this dogmatic idealism as sort of a level of skepticism of outer objects that they're a person couldn't really be argued out of if they actually believe in it. So the problematic idealism is an epistemological claim, and it's saying that the objects outside of us, that these external objects, it's not making the metaphysical claim that these objects definitely don't exist or that they're impossible. It's just making the claim that they are doubtful and that you can't be sure that they exist. And so it's sort of a weaker claim than the dogmatic idealist. And so Kant is actually going to focus on the problematic idealist. And the reason for this is because the dogmatic idealist will even doubt, uh, this internal object, or at least they will doubt that you have any memory of seeing it, even just half a second ago. That, a person could say that they just popped into existence with, all their memories and everything half a second ago. And there's no way to know that that didn't happen. And so the dogmatic idealist can even doubt sort of internal states, where the problematic idealist at least accepts internal states. And in fact, they accept internal states as privileged over external states. And so that comes from Descartes, where he essentially said that I can doubt my physical body, but I can't doubt my mind. Therefore, the inner sense is privileged over the outer sense. And so the problematic idealist at least accepts sort of internal sense. And so that sort of gives Kant something to work with here. And so Kant offers an argument, which I have sort of enumerated right here. So Kant wants to refute problematic idealism. So he offers this theorem here, where he says, the mere but empirically determined consciousness of my own existence proves the existence of objects in space outside myself. And so that's his theorem, and then he wants to prove it here. And so I've enumerated his argument from the critique here. And so number one, I am conscious of my own existence as determined in time, and I'll go through each of these premises and conclusions in detail here in a minute, but I'll just read them off here. So the first one, I am conscious of my own existence as determined in time. The second one, all determinations of time presuppose something permanent or persistent in perception. And so I have permanent, and then I have persistent here because in my translation of the Critique of Pure Reason, it says it uses the word permanent, but in one of the external sources, uh, the the philosopher uh, actually translates it as persistent or persistent thing. And so I've kind of put it in both ways here. So all determinations of time presuppose something permanent or persistent in perception. Number three, this permanent or persistent thing, however, cannot be something within me because my existence in time can be determined only through this permanent, persistent thing. Number four, the perception of this permanent, persistent thing, therefore, is possible only through a thing outside me and not through the mere representation of a thing outside me. And so this is, going back to that thing I was talking about earlier. So through a thing outside me and not through just a representation. So not just this representation here of the thing outside me. And so then his conclusion here at 5, consequently, the determination of my existence in time is possible only by means of the existence of actual things that I perceive outside me. And so that's sort of his his conclusion, his refutation, that the determination of my existence in time is possible only by means of the existence of actual things that I perceive outside me. And so this argument here is sort of notoriously difficult to understand. And so I actually went to 2 different external sources for this. And so I have that written here. So in what's to follow, everything that's in black is directly from Kant's critique. Points in green are from Dina Emans, who is actually the one who put the persistent and persistent thing in her translation of this. And I believe she's actually German, so she's probably going by the actual German writing of this, which is the original form. But anyway, so in green are the points by Dina Emans or Emans, which is in chapter 7 of the Cambridge Companion to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and points in red are by Ralph M. Bader, which is in chapter 11 of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, a Critical Guide. And then points written in blue are sort of my own thing. So in green and red are all direct quotes from these external sources. And so these external sources essentially go through and try to make sense of each of these different premises in Kant's proof here. In fact, Dina Emans actually tries to, sort of go through and look at just the critique, not external writings of Kant's or other writings that Kant has made, and sort of come up with sort of a defense of this proof actually succeeding. I think a lot of philosophers sort of think that this proof has not succeeded in refuting the problematic idealist, but these 2 philosophers, these 2 Kant scholars, are going to try and show that Kant actually does succeed. And so that is how I will go through this argument here. All right, so let's look at the first premise here. I am conscious of my own experience as determined in time. And so in green here we have Dina Emans. So I am able to order everything or almost everything that I have experienced in time. We can order our representations in time in such a manner that this order can be judged to be wrong or right. And so that's saying that we have, in our mind, we have, if we're looking at this object, there is the object at t0, and then there's the object at t1, and we'll pretend that these squares are the same. And, then we can go up to the object, and we'll say that's tn, and we'll say that this is the present, the object at the present. But we can order our sensations, so these are sort of our memory of these sensations in the past, where this one here is in the present. And so we can order these things that we've experienced in time, and then further, we can order them so that they can be judged to be wrong or right. We can, if we say flipped T1 and T naught around here, we could be able to say, well, no, actually T naught came before T1. And so we can actually judge these things to be right or wrong. Then, so with Bader here, he says Kant is asserting not just the existence of a bare subject of consciousness, i.e., the determining self, but the existence of a determinable self, and therewith the existence of a manifold of inner states that exist in time. And so that's essentially saying this same thing up here, that we have sort of a determining we have a determining self, which I guess you could say is sort of the overall consciousness, but we also have a determined self, which is sort of the self that we sort of conceptualize, that we sort of, this, when we think of this is me and this was me, yesterday, and this was me an hour ago, and things like that. So that is the determinable self, and it's there that we take this manifold of inner states and sort of think of them as being in time. So all that the refutation requires is that it is in principle possible to establish the objective ordering of internal mental states in time. So fallibility is thus not a problem. And so what that's saying is that it's possible for us to have a correct order of states in time, but that doesn't mean that that all of our ordering of states in time have to be right. It's possible for us to be wrong about it, but it's also possible for us to be right about it. So I put here in blue, a person can be wrong about their internal mental states, but it is possible for them to be right. And so this is sort of avoiding that dogmatic radical skeptic by essentially saying that that we can be right about our internal states, which the sort of dogmatic skeptic would say that is impossible. And so that's sort of what this first premise is saying. I am conscious of my own existence as determined in time. So then the second premise here, all determinations of time presuppose something permanent or persistent in perception. Then so we have, according to the analogies, so that's the analogies of experience, which is the substance, the cause and effect, and then sort of I think Kant called it community. So sort of seeing everything, seeing something in space sort of happening all at once. So seeing sort of a spatial object as it extended its space here. So this is sort of happening, I guess, at the same time as this part of it here. And so those were the analogies of experience. So the unity of experience presupposes the definite determination of experiences in time. Therefore, an absolute persistent, or more precisely, an absolutely persistent substance must be presupposed. And so here, Dina Eamons talks about Kant's actual example. So if we have, sort of a river here, and we think of a boat right here, and we think of it sort of crossing the river. If we think of this boat as crossing the river, then we presuppose that there is something persisting through time, that we are at T1 here and at T2 here, and that this is something that has persisted through time, that this boat here at T1 is the same boat as that one at T2. And so the part of this that I wanted to sort of point out for sure here is the objective order is nothing other than the succession of thoroughgoing causally linked states of affairs. And so I have that in this sort of different shade of green because that relates up to this up here, that there are not multiple times but one single continuous time. And essentially what that means is if we have our boat here, so if we have our boat here at T1, and then it travels over to here at, T2, then we wouldn't sort of say, okay, that's where this one time ends. And uh, so it ends right there, and then this T2 going to T3 is happening, in some completely new time. There is just the one time by that is the succession of states from T1 to T2 to T3. There isn't sort of a concatenation of multiple different times. That time is this unified thing, and I talked about a bit about that in my talk of the analogies of experience. And so the objective order is nothing other than the succession of thoroughgoing causally linked states of affairs. And so that means that, the boat being here at T1 sort of caused the boat being here at T2, that there is this thoroughgoing causally linked state of affairs. And then the boat being here at T2 can be sort of thought of as causing the boat being there at T3. And so that is this, all determinations of time presuppose something permanent in perception. So like this boat here, being sort of the same substance at T1 as it is at T2, and the same substance at T2 being the same substance at T3, and then sort of by the transitive property, it's the same substance between T1 and T3, and so that is our something permanent in perception, and so that is the second premise there. And so if we move down here to our third premise, so this permanent or persistent thing, however, cannot be something within me. So it cannot be something within me. And so this is sort of trying to take it out of this idea that that our inner states are sort of more important or something more real than our outer states, because my existence in time can be determined only through this permanent thing. And so it's saying that we need this permanent external thing to actually determine our self in time. That the internal state is not privileged over the external state. And so Kant says this. So in black is Kant is actually right from the Critique. So in all change of appearances, substance is permanent, and its quantum in nature is neither increased nor diminished. And so you could think of that as kind of like the conservation of mass. That if you have, say, your phone in front of you right now, you can be sure that tomorrow that the phone will essentially have the same mass, the same size, and everything as it does now, and you can be sure that it had the same yesterday. And nowadays we could get into, well, has something been, a few atoms been scratched off of it or whatever. But the idea is sort of this conservation of mass, that there's this conservation of substance that Kant is sort of interested in here. So since neither the inner representation nor the empirical self can be thought of as absolutely persistent, they are excluded by the analogies as possible candidates of the permanent or persistent thing. Substance underlies all time determination. And so essentially what that means, so I put this down here, so substance applies to time determination, is sort of means that it applies to phenomena, to our outer senses. And to summarize Ralph Bader, to show that something is a substance, it has to be proven that it is permanent. Kant says that the self cannot be proven to be permanent, since permanence can only be proven of outer objects via their conservation of quantity, and not the self, which do not follow such conservation laws. The self can fade out of existence, and therefore one cannot apply the category of substance. So that's one of his, categories of understanding, to the self or its inner states, and therefore the self cannot be what underlies all time determination. And so Kant is careful to point out that this does not say that the self, i.e. the soul, is not permanent, only that it cannot be proven of the self. And so what this is essentially saying is, say we have some object, and say, it's some triangular object, but it undergoes some change in time, and uh, I'm showing as a triangle and square, but you could think of, you take your phone and you sort of crumple it into, in a trash compactor or something. You could, think of just some change in an object, just sort of any general change. But I'm showing it here as sort of a triangle going to a square. And so this would be at time t1. This is at time t2. And so this is, there is some persistent substance. The phone being compacted in the trash compactor is still made out of all like the same stuff, and so the outer substance remains the same. Whereas if we look at some inner state, so you have, you're thinking about some object that's a triangle. Well, in the future, you could stop thinking about it, and then you'd be thinking about something else. But this object here sort of becomes nothing, and so there is not really a persistent substance in our inner states. And so this idea of persisting does not apply to inner states. And so that is sort of how we can tell that this thing cannot be, this permanent or persistent thing cannot be something within me, because my existence in time can be determined only through this permanent or persistent thing. And so the inner states of our consciousness do not follow this sort of persistence or permanence that Kant says is presupposed of external things. And in fact, you could even say that, so Kant says you can't prove that, say, your soul here has to persist to your soul here. Kant says that that it doesn't. It's not necessarily the case that your soul can blink out of existence, but you can't prove that it doesn't blink out of existence, say, when you die or something. So it can't be proven of the self, but that doesn't say that that the self is not permanent. And so that is our third premise there. Then so the perception of this permanent or persistent thing, therefore, is possible only through a thing outside me, and not through the mere representation of a thing outside me. So the representation of a thing outside me would be an internal state, which we know from this that the internal state is not necessarily persisting, and so only the thing outside me can persist. So to completely refute the problematic idealist, we obviously need to justify the understanding of outer object that includes not only the meaning of spatial object, but also the meaning of real object. And so essentially what Dina Emmons says about this is that that it's a thing that's real, is something that undergoes this sort of cause and effect, this thoroughgoing cause and effect with each other. And so if we look down here, so a real thing can be sufficiently distinguished from a product of the imagination by the criterion that it stands in thoroughgoing lawful connection with other things in perception. So according to the postulate of actuality, that which is lawfully connected with the material conditions of experience is actual. And we know from the previous premise that that this cause and effect, so this we can think of as sort of cause and effect, like the boat, where, the boat being at existing at T1 sort of causes the boat existing at T2. But this here doesn't have to hold for imagined objects. So objects sort of in our inner state. So this doesn't have to hold for inner objects. So, like the idea that we can have our inner object and then it goes to nothing sort of if we stop thinking about it, where the persistent thing outside of us doesn't become nothing when we stop thinking about it. So the only sense Kant can attach to the concept of reality is that of something given in sensation that we determine according to the categories as an object of experience. So the categories, being things like substance and cause and effect and simultaneity and things like that. All right, then so we get to Kant's conclusion here. So consequently, the determination of my existence in time is possible only by means of the existence of actual things that I perceive outside me. So although one can in this way establish the existence of outer objects to which one is perceptually related, one cannot establish which outer representations are in fact the result of outer intuition. We cannot establish that any particular outer representation does constitute an outer intuition rather than outer imagination. So with respect to any actual particular outer representation, we cannot rule out the possibility that is the result of imagination, making the existence of a particular outer objects doubtful. Thus, Kant's refutation of idealism is concerned with identifying the preconditions that must be satisfied for inner experience to be possible. And so this is essentially saying, what Ralph Bader is essentially saying here is that Kant has at least successfully shown that the preconditions for inner experience to be possible, have been satisfied here. But that doesn't mean that we know any actual sort of experience is caused by an outer existence. And so, if we have our representation here of this object here, we know that it's possible that it could be caused by some outer state, but we also know that it could just be, the product of imagination. But what Kant has shown is that it's possible for things to be caused by outer states, and so that's essentially what that means is that we can be wrong about something being an outer object, but it is possible for it to be an outer object, and so therefore the problematic idealist has been refuted, at least in that sense. And so if we go back up here, so the mere but empirically determined consciousness of my own existence proves the existence of objects in space outside myself. And so I guess my own thoughts on this, so I don't find Kant's argument all that compelling. I mean, if you actually look at these external sources that I look at, these two people, Dina Emmons and Ralph M. Bader, both kind of jump through hoops trying to sort of defend Kant's argument here. And even with their defenses of it, I still don't find it all that terribly compelling, especially since we have to buy into Kant's sort of analogies of experience. So we have to buy into, Kant's earlier philosophy, which, I mean, some of that is compelling. I don't know that, Kant's particular, exposition of it is 100% convincing, but The problem is that in order for this proof to even begin to work, you have to sort of buy into a lot of Kant's other stuff, which is so he's kind of building this off of the scaffold of his philosophy previously in the critique, and so in order, like I said, in order to find this compelling, you have to find his previous philosophy to be sufficiently compelling. And even then, the two sources that I sort of go through here both, sort of talk about how this proof is sort of notoriously, hard to follow and difficult to understand, and that Kant doesn't do a good job of sort of, you know, justifying a lot of his claims in it. This is actually a fairly short part of the Critique of Pure Reason, and so Kant doesn't do the best job of actually justifying a lot of his claims here. But so the idea is that Kant wanted to refute the problematic idealism. He wanted to show that we can be sure that external objects are real. And then in the next section is when he gets into kind of his famous distinction between phenomena and noumena, where phenomena are sort of the objects of experience, where noumena are sort of the inaccessible objects that as they exist in themselves. Uh, and so that will be the topic of the next video in this Kant playlist. But anyway, I hope you found this at least somewhat illuminating as far as understanding Kant's refutation of idealism. I know this is, kind of it's a notoriously difficult part of this book to understand. Even the experts, find it a bit puzzling, and so, yeah, that's why I kind of, took quite a bit of time on just this sort of small part of the book. But anyway, I'm kind of rambling now. I will see you in the next video.